The Color of Wealth, Race, Wealth, and the Criminal Justice System in Baltimore Forum brought local advocates together to surface potential policy solutions to disrupt barriers to building wealth for communities who have historically experienced divestment.
We were talking about the release of our report called No Exit, which looks at the debt collection system in Maryland. And what we found from our research is that the way we have our debt collection system in Maryland currently exacerbates poverty and widens the racial wealth gap in Maryland. We have a lot of policies that penalize the poor, but we don't have very many policies that actually help people escape a debt trap.
Hosted by the Job Opportunities Task Force and Maryland Consumer Rights Coalition, data and insights were shared from a coming report by the Insight Center, with research led by economists Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity.
So today's event was about sharing data and research from Insight Center about the color of wealth and the intersection between race, the criminal justice system, and asset building and wealth in Baltimore City specifically.
We've been working with a couple of economists for the last few years, Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity, around looking at the dynamics of race and wealth and what it's telling us about the future of this country. And I think that one of the most important things we've learned is just how little wealth blacks have across all the cities that we've looked at, that they tend to have the lowest levels of wealth amongst most of the groups that we examine. You know, this is a really, really big problem. I think it's one of the biggest issues of our generation. And so it requires a bold approach, one that's going to really address the real issue, which is intergenerational wealth. That means that that families have the ability to pass down wealth to the next generation. And so this idea of a young adult trust, that is seeding young adults with capital, anywhere from $20,000 to $60,000, could be a solution to actually deal with racial wealth inequities. We're actually going to be releasing a report in the next couple of weeks that's looking at millennial women, particularly millennial women of color, and wealth. And what that's going to really show is that we're really seeing that particularly Latinx and black women have very low levels of wealth. Black women have the lowest levels of wealth. So take this for example. Women under 30 who've been arrested. White women who've been arrested who are under 30 have more wealth than the black woman who's never been arrested, much more wealth. And so it's really telling us that you know, although people are going to college, they're working hard, they're doing the best for their family, that's not enough to overcome these low levels of wealth.
Participants highlighted promising solutions and practices following the morning panel.
I thought it was really helpful to have the data broken down by health. I thought that was a really interesting way to think about, all right, what's the impact of health and our physical health and on wealth and vice versa. And so that was really eye-opening to me, that we've really got to figure out a way to solve this problem, because otherwise our overall well-being is at risk. It's not just about having more cash so that we can do what we want to do. It's about our well-being overall.
Using my own story at how I am a licensed nurse technician, worked at the VA for over 8 years, and the minute I got that criminal record, it prohibited me from working in any hospital, any nursing home, and my story is the story of thousands of women who live in Baltimore. Baltimore is a hospital town, right? And so when you are a woman trying to get your life back in order and trying to build wealth for you and your family, typically that is an industry that you go into. But because occupational licensing in Maryland is a problem for individuals with criminal records, because we have not figured out a way to be more innovative with making sure that people have access to occupational licensing and the laws are caught up to the times, many people are forced to work low-wage jobs or get 2 and 3 jobs, making less than $15 an hour just to make ends meet.
Watch the panel presentation and discussion next.
Before we have questions, and we will have questions, I want to give opportunity to speak to our great partners in this event, who have been really wonderful, and it's been great getting to know both of you. First, Marceline White, who's the Executive Director of the Maryland Consumer Rights Coalition, is going to talk about the research that they've done and the policy work that they're engaged in.
Good morning. It's so great to be here, and I'm so happy to be working with JOTF and the Insight Center to talk about the racial wealth gap and what we can do. I appreciate Dr. Hamilton's remarks, and I think what I'm going to try to do is talk a little bit about our report that we just released and our findings, and looking in the context of the racial wealth gap, what this means when you are dealing with debt, which many of us are. Just briefly, the Maryland Consumer Rights Coalition is a statewide coalition. We work on advancing economic rights and reducing the racial wealth gap, and we do this through our own research, through direct service work, particularly with older adults, through education about people's rights, and through working on the Community Reinvestment Act, trying to get banks and financial institutions to invest in communities that have been neglected for decades in Baltimore, as we well know. And we are a membership organization, so you can join as an individual organizational member as well, and I invite you to do so. And one brief remark about the payday lending, as Courtney mentioned, we were able, Cash Campaign, MCRC, JOTF, and others were able to close a loophole to end payday lending in Maryland a few years ago. But what this means is that if you know someone who's taken out a payday loan online, the loan is unenforceable. So if they've taken out a payday loan, the Commissioner of Financial Regulations Office can send a cease and desist order to the lender, and the person doesn't have to continue to pay that loan. So I want to make sure everyone knows that if you know someone who took out a payday loan, it is illegal because it is above our rate cap, and we can help you. You can email me, I can direct you to the Commissioner of Financial Regulations website or their contact, but they can help people who have these loans get these loans stopped and they don't have to pay them anymore. So just to be clear that we do have some solutions as well if people have taken out online loans. So I want to talk about our report. It's called No Exit. You can pick, no, I didn't do that right. You can pick it up on the table, and it really focuses on looking at debt collection. No exit. It's on the table over there. It focuses on looking at debt collection process in Maryland and what this means. And we decided to call the report No Exit for a couple reasons. One is that it really gets to the heart of the issues related to that we describe in the report: debtors' prisons, wage garnishment, and civic, which is state-owed debt. And for many Marylanders who are struggling with debt, the practices in our state create a vicious cycle of poverty from which few can emerge, let alone emerge unharmed. What we've seen is that the Maryland policies and practices that are in place right now with debt collection do not provide any path out of poverty for low-income communities, low-income people, especially communities of color. It actually makes it much harder for them to ever escape debt and to leave a cycle of debt. Maryland's failed to enact policies that help struggling families. They've pursued policies that deepen poverty, and as our research found, they widen the already existing racial wealth gap in our state. So Dr. Hamilton talked already about some of the issues and drivers of poverty and debt. Just to put a little context in Maryland, costs have increased in the past 10 years. I think everyone knows that. Rents have gotten higher. The prices of mortgages are higher. More than 20% of Marylanders are asset poor, meaning if they lost their income, they wouldn't have enough money to survive over the next 2 or 3 months. There's no safety net. Most people don't have, 40% don't have $500 in savings. So if anything goes wrong, you're looking at a collapse of a financial household. You're looking at a financial crisis if you lose your job. Some of the drivers, the largest drivers of debt in Maryland are healthcare costs. So any kind of healthcare emergency that you didn't plan for, even if you have healthcare, we all know a lot of people have very high deductibles and they can't sustain it. And the other is student loan debt, which is a huge driver. Again, looking at the research, people who want to improve their lives, we know education is supposed to be a pathway, and it is, but there's a huge cost, and especially for communities of color who have a racial wealth gap, who end up having to take on more debt to go to college or to go to grad school. And what we found is the racial wealth gap contributes to non-white borrowers having more consumer debts, and that includes more debts in collection because they have more debt. So for example, 43% of non-white residents had at least one debt in collection, while 19% of white borrowers did. I think one thing that is significant is if you look across the state in Maryland, more debt collection lawsuits are filed in Maryland counties that have large communities of color. And that's that's what our quantitative research found. And again, that's because if you're a woman or a man of color and you're going to college, you often end up having to take out larger loans because your family may not have the assets to provide for you. Same thing, home ownership is lower, and you may not have the ability without taking out a larger loan to be able to get a home, even though we know that it can be beneficial. So when an individual falls behind, what happens is that the creditor, so the bank, a doctor, a bail bondsman, as we'll talk about, a landlord will pursue the debt, and you'll go to district court. What this means is a district court are loans that are under $5,000. So we're not talking about a huge amount of money, but an important amount of money. If a lot of people don't have $500, they don't have $5,000 to pay off this debt. And what happens is when you go to district court, there are fewer rules of evidence. That means there are fewer safeguards than in a higher level of a higher court level. So they don't have to, the creditor doesn't have to prove as much to take you to court. A lot of times we also know that people don't even receive the notice. If you are having a landlord pursue you, you've often moved because you couldn't pay the rent, and they'll send it to your old address, your last known address. You may not even know that you've been served. So there are lots of issues, but when you go to court for this debt collection, many times the judgment will come out against you, and that in part is because 98% of people who go to court for a debt, the debtor or the alleged debtor, is unrepresented. They don't have a lawyer. 98% of the creditors, the medical doctor, the landlord, the bail bondsman, the bank, is represented by a lawyer. So the deck is already stacked against you, of course. And what happens? Okay. And what happens is that there will be a debt lodged against you, and you're supposed to pay that. What they ask you to do is go in and then fill out a form talking about how they can take your money. So they'll ask you to fill out a form that is your wages and assets. They can figure out how to take your money that you have now been found to owe. Again, whether or not you legally owe it or whether or not there's other issues. And so a lot of times people may not receive that either, or they're like, I don't have money. I don't have money. What are they going to do? When that happens, the creditor, again, like whether it's a doctor, landlord, banker, whatever, can go and ask the judge to compel you to come to court. And they do that by putting out a warrant for your arrest. It's called a body attachment. It's literally a lien against your body to come into court to tell them how they can take money from you, right? And so what we found in Maryland, this is working with UB Law and others, in 2014 there were 28,000 arrest warrants sworn out on people's bodies to get them to come to court to talk to you about how they can take your money and how their assets are, what their assets are. And out of those, 77 Marylanders were jailed for debt. I don't know if this is good, but just like literally, we think this is something that happened in Dickens. We think this is something from the 19th century. We had 77 people who were in jail because they owed a consumer debt. They owed a landlord, they owed the bank, they owed a doctor, which seems crazy, right? We think so. And what happens is they can either come to your house and pick you up and take you to jail, or if you're driving and you are pulled over for some other reason, when they run your number, they'll see that you have this arrest warrant and they can take you again. We found with our research, sometimes you can post a bond that is the exact amount of the debt owed and they'll let you out. If you can't post a bond, you can sit in jail. The other thing that happens is sometimes they're supposed to take you to the district court commissioner to fill out this form. If they pick you up on a Friday, there's no court in session. So you're there all weekend no matter what. And these are people who, you may have a wage job, you may have children, doesn't matter, you're picked up. I'm gonna try to move quickly, but what I wanna say is the reason we call this no exit is because one of the places where we see this happening a lot is with bail bondsmen, especially we looked at Baltimore City and Baltimore County. If you look at what happens, bail bondsmen are some of the most aggressive. This talks about who is going to pursue a body attachment. Bail bondsmen are some of the most aggressive groups that pursue a body attachment. So are landlords such as Jared Kushner, who owns a lot of rental properties in the Baltimore area, who is one of the most aggressive at pursuing a body attachment, an arrest warrant against people who owe a debt. So one of the examples is a bail bondsman. In communities of color, we know they're over-policed and over-incarcerated, right? Oftentimes, if there's a bail for a criminal or other issue, family members will come together to pay the bail. Now, if for whatever reason the person can't pay back the bail bondsman will go after the grandmother or the mom or the family member and put a body attachment on them and jail them because of the other person who owed the bail bond, which just creates a vicious cycle of poverty. Another example, again, is if you can't afford to pay, you're held up all weekend. If you have a wage job, you may lose that job because you aren't there, because you're in jail, because you got picked up on a Friday when you were driving. And again, that creates a vicious cycle of poverty. If you can afford to pay the bond, you're released. If you can't, you're jailed. It's a two-tiered system of justice that is completely unjust. And of course, jailing someone for debt serves no constructive purpose. They're no danger of their community, they're simply poor, which is not why somebody should be jailed. I am going to talk very briefly about debt collection, because again, this is all about you're arrested because you owe this debt. If you look at debt collection, our research found, as I said, there are more debt collection suits filed in Maryland, counties that have large communities of color. It's in our report, but 76,611 Marylanders faced wage garnishment in 2016. It's a lot of people. 48,000, almost 50,000, or 27,000, sorry, faced bank account seizures. And the amount of wages that are protected from garnishment are set by state statute. Maryland is one of the worst in our surrounding areas. So Maryland, according to the National Consumer Law, gets an F. Am I going to do this right? Gets an F. We only protect 75% of federal wages, or 30 times the federal minimum wage. This means people can keep $11,310 per year. $11,310 per year is what you can keep from and protect from garnishment. Everything else can go back to pay the debtor, right? Now, the federal poverty guideline for an individual is $12,140, which means you are pushed below the poverty line while you're working and paying your debt back. Again, this is unfair. It's a vicious cycle of poverty. There's no exit. If all of your money is going to pay one debt, you don't have anything if anything else goes wrong in your life. And we often know that people that are living in very fragile financial situations, things go wrong. You don't have any money as a backup because everything's going to pay back the one debt, which means you may have to default on another debt. We did also look at state-owed debt, and I think a couple of things I just want to briefly mention are when you look at state-owed debt, this is what the state of Maryland is collecting. Our research found statistically that racial demographics are a better predictor than income of where and for how much the state of Maryland sued than other economic indicators. So it's not even just based on income, it's based on race. That's the best predictor of where they're going to sue and who they're going to sue to collect back their debt. Geographic indicators had the strongest relationship in locations which CCU sued for debt. But the other thing to note is we've worked hard to pass regulations to restrict private debt collectors, to try to limit the statute of limitations, get rid of debt that is out of 12, 15 years, other things. Maryland as a state exempts itself from all of those rules. So as a state, Maryland can collect debts on you forever. They can seize your tax returns. They can collect all information on you. So when your financial situation improves, their debt collection efforts can begin again. So I am going to leave it there. We've got a lot of recommendations. There's a lot more in this report, a lot of tables, the methodology, our statistical methodologies in there. I simply want to say that we often think of Maryland as a blue state and a progressive state. When it comes to economic issues, we are not. When it comes to economic issues, we are regressive, and we have a vision that penalizes poor people and blames poor people. We have recommendations in here. We would love to have everybody work to help pass better laws and policies at the state and local level that really gives families who are struggling and who are living in poverty, particularly communities of color in places like Baltimore and Prince George's, a way out of debt, looking at ability to repay, looking at other kinds of policies that will help people sustain and maintain their families as opposed to punishing the poor. Thank you.
Thank you, Marceline. So Derek is like triple, quadruple booked, which is very common. And so we want to open up to questions. At the same time, I also want to recognize Nikki Thompson, who I think all of you know from Job Opportunities Task Force, who's been a huge advocate and ally and probably the most important person in this process, who is also, as you know, very knowledgeable in this and many other things. But I would like to open up to questions. So if folks have any questions for Derek, Marceline, or Nikki, please.
And maybe we pause after the questions and let Nikki go again, so we don't take her time. I could leave, and you probably should hear.
Any questions for? Okay, go ahead.
Ultimately, we need an economic bill of rights. You know, so I've talked a lot about with Sandy Darity, baby bonds, or what's more accurate, baby trust. To me, the source of wealth inequality is, I'm going to repeat it, wealth begets more wealth, and black people don't have wealth to begin with. It's not behavioral, it's structural. If you lack capital, inequality is locked in. It takes capital to get any of these vehicles to shield yourself from all these vulnerabilities about debt stripping. If you have resources, you're better able to function in society. So what if we had as a birthright capital? So we're talking about a birthright to capital where every child is endowed at birth with some seed capital that they can use when they become an adult towards some asset enhancing endeavor, like all those things I mentioned, a debt-free college education, a down payment on a home, or some seed capital to start a business. That doesn't mean we don't need a federal job guarantee. That doesn't mean we don't need to impose sanctions on predatory lenders like payday lenders, right? But ultimately, to address wealth, it is capital. That's the reason. These other things are important in everybody's day-to-day lives, and we want to avoid people being exploited or extracted from. But we need a whole policy infrastructure that offers people empowerment as opposed to our current policy infrastructure that puts the onus of inequality and the blame of poverty on individuals and uses punitive measures like locking them up, treating them as a surplus population. Instead, we need to rethink how we do policies in general, and baby trust would be one example. Literally provide capital resources based on the birth position that you're born into.
I'm just going to add briefly, I completely agree with that. And you know, in Maryland, we're pushing for the Fight for 15, which we think is really important. But $15 an hour is still not going to be enough when you look at what rents cost and what mortgages cost. So we need bold, visionary solutions, like Dr. Hamilton talked about. But also in the interim, we need to look at using things like the Community Reinvestment Act. This is where you demand that banks, where you deposit your money, reinvest in communities. And we don't see that right now. We know that there are no bank branches in East and West Baltimore, which is why you have people going to pawn shops and to check cashers, because the bank branches aren't there. But we need to be working to demand that if they're holding our money, they reinvest in our communities. And that, by reinvest, I mean provide small business loans for entrepreneurs in East and West Baltimore. We mean provide sustainable home solutions that people can meet that is not going to get them in debt and are not subprime loans. And I think that's another thing in the interim as we're pushing for these very important, bold issues in the small, in the today, right now, we can also be looking at how do we hold people accountable when they're taking money out of communities, but they're not reinvesting in communities.
Yeah. Nicole, Nicole.
So really quick, wealth and net worth are analogous. Net worth just means the accumulation of all the debt versus everything you own. It's everything you own, the value of everything you own versus the value of everything you owe. That's this definition.
And then, how do you recommend that we hold banks accountable to community? Because what I found is that each bank has a community engagement office where they're supposed to support financially community-based organizations, grassroots organizations, but they're not doing it. So how do you recommend that grassroots organizations like mine, Out for Justice, go to these banks and let them know that we know that this is some sort of a policy, or, how do we hold those, like, what's the language that we use to hold those institutions accountable for what we know they're supposed to be doing?
Yeah. So I'm talking about a policy infrastructure that provides viable, competitive public options. I'm arguing that, in part, we're too reliant on the private sector. We need public options that provide empowerment as opposed to, we can do regulations, we can come up with various policies, and I'm saying we should do those things. But at the end of the day, the profit incentives for firms is to extract, is to exploit. That's not going to go away. Firms are in the business to make more money, and vulnerable populations are a population from which they can make more money from. So in my view, we need public alternatives to allow people to have vehicles for economic mobility and success that shield them from some of the private sector incentives. So what are some of those things? Let's stop being abstract. Public banking. What if the public was engaged in providing short-term loans for people that couldn't pay their gas bill at a certain point in time? A federal job guarantee or municipal job guarantee. What if the public sector literally provided a job with decent benefits, decent wages as a competitive alternative to the private sector? Not only would that directly offer a wage to individuals, but it would sanction the private sector so that if they wanted to compete in the marketplace, they would at least have to offer the wage that's being offered in the public sector, the benefits that are being offered in the public sector. The woman that's getting exploited at a waitress job through sexual harassment would have a viable alternative to feed her family rather than have to put up with abuse on a daily basis. I think ultimately, so let me be clear, ultimately, CRA, those things are important, and regulation is important, but if we have a public sector that's doing their job, that's providing economic security for its population, then the private sector can go ahead and be cowboys, because one, there'll be there'll be implicit sanctions on them, and then two, the public will have an alternative and not have to be relying on an infrastructure that is hell-bent on exploitation and extraction.
And I just want to add two things. One is that New York City is looking at public banking right now, and it's something that we believe will come up in the Maryland General Assembly next year as well, the idea of a public bank. So it's something that we're committed to working on. And also in the interim, with the Community Reinvestment Act, we can talk more offline, but we do trainings for community organizations about how to engage with the banks, and also like when there are opportunities, which is usually when they're being examined by regulators and when they're trying to merge or acquire another bank. Those are the best opportunities to really, when they're going to be more susceptible to pressure. But we can talk later offline too, because we do these trainings and stuff on that. But we are also looking at a public bank option in Maryland.
And I just want to add, I mean, the public bank movement is real. Los Angeles is voting on forming a public bank this November, and much of that is local economic forces and the reality in California with the legalization of marijuana and a lack of kind of capital for businesses there. But it has also a lot of support in grassroots organizations, and particularly in communities of color who are underbanked, because they will have a real option for banks without having to kind of
some extent, I think it is as simple as putting more money in people's hands. But let me explain and elaborate a little more. It's just not income money, it is capital. The key ingredient for wealth literally is capital. And that's a point I don't want to downgrade. I want to make that front and center and clear. So I'm talking about a policy infrastructure that is not so hell-bent on managing poor people, but really giving them the resources to manage themselves. And the first ingredient when it comes to wealth is capital. Now, that does not solve all our problems, right? So one critique of baby trust, people often say things like, well, what about early childhood? And I respond, well, what about early childhood? We should invest in that as well. So baby bonds or baby trusts don't solve everything for us, but it really addresses wealth. I just showed you that even when black people get high levels of education, have good health, have good education, they still don't have wealth. So I'm talking about a capital endowment to allow people to get into those vehicles of wealth creation. But your question had a lot more in it than just that simple answer. And again, that's why I think we need a package of goods, an economic bill of rights, to provide public options in many domains, and we can go through them. Obviously, we need to stop locking people up for debt and locking people up for nonviolent crimes. That's obviously one. We need to, in my view, get rid of credit scores, because that becomes another way to stratify and use race. I think we need tuition-free education from grade school all the way through college, not necessarily because what education does for you in the market sense, because that is a value that we all should have, or we all should have access to. Education in its own right allows people to have analytical thought, to be civically engaged, and that's one of the things we should emphasize. So, I can keep going on, and I want to be respectful to my panelists, but I think we need to get out of the frame of trying to manage the decisions of poor people, but instead offering them the resources so that they can define their own goals and achieve those goals. And then we need to provide alternatives to a private sector, which by definition, I'll give you another quick anecdote. Chris Rock made the joke about the tiger in the circus, where the person, you all might be familiar with it, the tiger on the bicycle, we thought the tiger went crazy because he bit a man. He said the tiger didn't go crazy for biting a man, the tiger on the bicycle, the tiger went tiger, the tiger on the bicycle is crazy. In essence, the private sector, that's what they do. They are for profit. And I'm not saying we have to get rid of the private sector altogether, but we need viable alternatives to the private sector, because they ultimately will try to exploit and extract if the government doesn't play a role in providing alternatives.
How much time do we have left for questions?
Just two quick things. I think that there's been a lot of research.
Okay, I have to coordinate that will be done.
What just said to you about providing with direct capital, and that it is the most play, and I think leverage that to create wealth generation through varying techniques. But my question is actually for Jacob around California recently eliminated the cash bail system. Kind of had some mixed results.
Yeah. Right. Sure. So if everyone is unfamiliar with this, California, through many years of advocacy and organization by some really incredible grassroots organizations, gained a lot of momentum around eliminating cash bail and replacing it with a system that would basically let everyone out and not hold people in pretrial detention. And a law was passed that eliminated cash bail but replaced it with a lot more judicial discretion. It allowed judges to detain people pre-trial who previously were not allowed to be detained, and implemented an algorithmic risk assessment in place of cash bail. So basically, we put in relevant inputs, and it tells the judge whether you're medium, low, or high risk for flight or recidiv or committing a crime while out on release. That's really bad and is really dangerous for a number of reasons, not the least of which being that the most common predictor for detaining people pre-trial for every risk assessment that I have seen is being black. So if you are black, you are much more likely to be held pre-trial. I mean, literally across every single tool. In addition, increasing judicial discretion is dangerous in California for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being is that judges in different areas have different opinions. California is a massive state and runs a very federalist kind of structure. And so counties in the interior, which tend to be very conservative, tend to have very large jail populations, and tend to have very high pretrial detention rates, are much more likely to set a standard of high risk that's much lower than it will happen in Los Angeles or San Francisco. So lessons learned here, right, are one is pay attention to what's happening to your bill as it is happening, and two, choose your sponsors correctly. I think that a danger here in California was the sponsor was interested in eliminating cash bail, not necessarily in promoting equity, not necessarily ending the, racist and prejudiced practices of detaining black people simply because they are black. He was much more interested in getting rid of cash bail, a system that he didn't totally understand and saw as just not making much sense. And so I think that disconnect is what led us to passing a law that ends cash bail but does not promote racial equity.
I just think it's important for us to think about, we oftentimes, really blame ourselves. Why can't we do better? And you hear a lot about, if we could just, stop buying shoes or not buy our children video games. And of course, people, save, but we have to know that a lot of those are myths. First of all, blacks do save at the same rates as whites, so that's not the issue. And the fact that this is deeply structural, it's not about the fact that someone made a poor decision, that we don't know how to act right, that largely these kinds of wealth gaps are because of historical policies.
Just happy that everyone came. People seem to have a good time. I wanted it to be interactive, especially since we advocate for the community going to Annapolis. So I didn't want to have an event where we didn't have the community voice their opinion. So I hope everyone got something out of it, and I hope everyone was happy to participate.
For the Real News Network, this is Dr. Kalila Harris.